So having talked about what the world has done to deal with a bunch of previous crises, we now want to talk about really the big question, right? What's going to happen in the next crisis? And there's a lot of concern about this because, as we've talked about, there's a sense that the things that worked in previous crises may not be available to us in the future. In particular, the United States seems both less able and less willing to resolve a crisis by itself, and it's not clear who or what might take its place. Similarly, the G7 seems a little bit less unified than it used to be, so the question is what will happen. Can the U.S. play its traditional role? Will the U.S. choose to lead? It's very unclear. If you think about the difference in attitude between the Trump administration and the Biden administration, you could imagine the United States maybe deciding to try to do something, or maybe saying, tough, it's everybody else's problem, we don't want to deal with it. Does the United States have the resources to lead? As I've pointed out, the U.S. share of global gross domestic product has been on a steady decline since World War II. So it's just not clear it has the clout that it once had. And to be clear, the United States still has something close to 20% of global GDP. It was very, very, I would say, artificially inflated at the end of World War II because all the other leading economies, of course, had been destroyed by the war. But anyhow, does the U.S. have the resources to lead? And this is probably the crucial thing. Do others follow along? Because given the change in the global economy and in the U.S. and in the size of the U.S. economy, more so in the future than in the past, the U.S. will want and need others to go along with it to really solve these crises. Can China take up the slack? So we get the same questions, right? Does China choose to lead? Well, maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. It's very hard to say. Does China have the resources to lead? Well, we often talk about China as the next hegemon and this sort of thing, but at least for the foreseeable future, China's economy will still be smaller than that of the United States. So even when it approaches the size of the U.S. economy, it's not as though its economy is going to be so big that it can do the kinds of things that the United States could do in the 1960s or 70s. And then, of course, do others follow along? And this is an interesting question because as much as the United States has lost influence and prestige and others have become resentful of the United States in the world, there's a lot of countries in the world and a lot of people in the world that are really quite leery of following China or of Chinese leadership. And if maybe beyond leery, right, maybe outright afraid or simply opposed. So that's a really important question as well. Can a new coalition emerge? Can we imagine a circumstance in which the U.S. and China join forces to address some new global crisis, or that the U.S. and Europe will do so, or that China and Europe will do so? And the answer, I think, of course, is we won't know until it happens. But yes, those things are possible, but any of those kinds of coalitions will be very challenging. It's probably not going too far out on a limb to say that the U.S. and Europe is the most easily imagined coalition, because in many respects that's what the G7 always was the U.S., Canada, Europe, and Japan. The U.S. and China, if the U.S. and China were to get together and really agree on how to do something, I think a lot of the rest of the world would fall into line fairly quickly. But given the rivalry, the growing rivalry between the U.S. and China, it's going to be tough. Given political attitudes in the United States and Europe, where there seems to be a little bit more what's in it for me sensibility than there was 10 or 20 or 50 years ago, one might suspect that even as the U.S. and Europe try to agree on something to do, that they might have a big argument over who exactly is going to foot how much of the bill, right? There's been a lot of respects in which the United States has been asking Europeans to pay more for things. The Europeans obviously aren't so keen on that idea. So it's just not clear if it can be pulled off. So one way of getting a look at this is at the economic crisis that's been imposed by the COVID-19 pandemic. Uh, I think as bad as this economic crisis has been, leaving aside the health crisis, it's hard to know how much future economic crises might be like this. Right? This is an economic crisis that comes out of a health crisis, and it's somewhat unique in that it's hitting every country in the world in almost the same way. Right? It's not really that we've had an economic contagion; we've had a contagion. And so it's hit every country in the world, and every country in the world has tried to take some measures to deal with it. Now, of course, some countries, because they're wealthier, have a lot more resources and a lot more options to try to deal with the problem than others. But there has not been, generally speaking, a big international, quote-unquote, bailout effort because everybody's in the same boat, more or less. For particular countries, the IMF has made money available in the short term, as it always has, and for those countries, that's been incredibly helpful. But what we're really seeing is that in the short term, recession has happened everywhere. That doesn't mean that it's the same for everyone, right? In rich countries, a recession has fairly little effect on some people, has a really horrible effect on other people, but there's some kind of safety net in most of the wealthy countries. In some of the poorer countries of the world, where people are much poorer to begin with and have much less safety net, it's causing really profound hardship. And while there's an assumption that once the pandemic is gotten under control, that economies will rebound fairly quickly, a lot of damage is going to be done in the meantime. Nonetheless, to get to the big question of this lecture, it's not clear to me that COVID is going to provide a real recipe or rather a good predictor of how the next real financial crisis is going to be dealt with. So we asked this question, what does the future hold? Of course, the answer is we don't know, but I think the big picture is not a pretty one. And a lot of people who work on these issues have a lot of worry. And basically the belief is that not necessarily a prediction that things won't work, but that the forces that have worked in the past are weaker now than they've been in the past. They look like they're going to get weaker still, and so there's just less confidence about the next crisis than there is looking backwards at the previous ones. And so we'll just have to see.